So thank you for joining the Inside Canberra $64 question at 65 Northbourne. Please come back every sitting Monday. But tonight we've got an exemplary Member of Parliament in that of Matt Keogh. And he's not just a Member of Parliament, he's done a lot more than that. In 2009 he was the Young Lawyer of the Year across Australia. And he's also been a customer service representative for iiNet. So that's a lot more difficult than being a parliamentarian, I would assume. So the topic tonight is how we can improve parliamentary democracy. So I've invited Matt to give a few words and to talk about his thoughts on what he thinks the future is of the system of democracy in the Parliament in Australia. Matt.
Hello everybody. I'm conscious that we've taken over nearly the entire restaurant, which makes it hard to find a place to stand, but thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for seemingly coming to listen to me, but I'm sure it's because you actually wanted to share each other's company. I've put together a few thoughts. Michael provided me with a few questions he thought I should try and address over the course of what my remarks are, but I think it'll probably get even more interesting actually in a more of a Q&A style. But I suppose the first thing that I wanted to just sort of mention was looking at, well, what is the system that we're presented with and some of the things that come out of that. So, as I'm sure all of you are astutely aware, you know, our preferential and mandatory voting system actually drives politics by and large to the centre. But what that of course does mean is that those that are not in the centre or further closer to the fringe, if you like, are more likely to become discontented and disenfranchised in that process. But I think the other thing to put with that though is that we're no longer really a society of, to use Michael Kirby's phrase, joiners. We don't join things. We don't join football clubs, a lot less of us go to church. We don't join unions in the same rate that we used to, and we certainly don't join political parties in the same way that we used to. And the thing about that is it actually robs us of the opportunities to have discussions about a broad range of issues and to experience people that might have a different view. And that's quite important when it comes to all of the different topics that come up for discussion in our, I'll say, political life, i.e. all of the things that happen in our country. So that dynamic has actually fundamentally changed over the last few decades. The other thing, though, that I think politicians are astutely aware of is that social media has had and the age of the internet has had a dramatic change on the way in which the population creates its expectations of government and the parliamentary process. They expect if they can be communicated with instantaneously and you can put things on Facebook. We've gotten used to that idea. We've gotten used to the idea that I don't have to wait until 10 a.m. on a weekday to go to the bank. I can do it online any time, except for between about 2 and 3 on a Sunday, which is so annoying. But because of that, there's this expectation that instead of we will elect a government and give them a number of years to work through a process to deliver on something which may actually take until their second term, the mindset is very much of, well, why haven't you done it already? We elected you last month. And that is actually a common refrain that we hear. You know, the state government in Western Australia was elected just on a year ago. And many people ask, well, why haven't they done X, Y, and Z yet in Western Australia? Not appreciating that when you are trying to change the direction of the great state of Western Australia and your priorities, it would probably be a good idea to get some drawings and designing work done before you replace a railway crossing. That takes time, but that is what we're confronted with. There's also what I have discerned to be a very interesting paradox, that the people gravitate to those that are out there as, if you like, conviction politicians. We often hear about how great Howard was as a conviction politician and he was out there standing for something, and that's what people want. But at the same time, what they don't want is politicians that backflip. And it creates a big problem, because if we want to get the policy right in any particular area, it's probably a good idea to make sure that we consult with stakeholders, that we engage with the policy debate, that we understand all of the different issues that may arise. And so if we go out and say, this is what I stand for, without any way of necessarily knowing that you can deliver on it, and then come back later and say, now that we've considered the issue, we're going to have to make this change and this change and this change, you will be accused of making a backflip, you'll be accused of breaking a political promise. And that context, I think, is very important for what we are seeing overall in politics. And it goes together with what I think has been a dramatic increase in a campaigning style of who do you trust, or you can't trust, blah, blah, blah. And that concept of the backflip and not accepting that maybe it's worthwhile investing in getting the policy right in the first place, and for some reason associating that with people and politicians not being of conviction. Related to that, in a funny way, plebiscites are terrible, because in my view they completely undermined the parliamentary system. We have a representative democracy. I would not propose changing that when you ask for changes, Michael. And when we have plebiscites, as much as they are superficially attractive, in my view, to the public, what they do actually do is undermine not just the role of politicians and the parliament, but they undermine any capacity to deliver on complex policy. Because all that will happen is that you end up going down a path where at least one side of the political debate will say, oh, well, we will throw that to a plebiscite, in an attempt to rob any other political party or political view of any authority in their position. And the reality is that a plebiscite, as I'm sure if you ask anyone who was part of the Republic referenda will understand, is it's difficult to convey complex issues where there might be multiple options if you're going down a plebiscite model. So the last sort of issue I sort of wanted to address was when I was asked about talking about the parliamentary system. For some bizarre reason, I thought it might be an idea to turn to the Federalist Papers, because I couldn't sleep probably. But there was one thing that I thought was that stood out for me as actually reflecting an issue that's current in modern Australian politics. And it was Federalist Paper number 10. Madison was writing about the problem of what he described as the faction. And what he really was talking about was his concern about the tyranny of the majority, and in particular, which when we refer to it now is a bit different to how he was actually writing about it then, which was his fear was that the property-less majority may rise up against the propertied and moneyed minority, and that it was important to have a large republic to ensure that there were many factions, and that this group could not come together. The relevance of that today is the concern that we see, to be honest, I think more in the elite press, and I say elite because I think often journalists always talk about politicians as being part of the elite but don't realise that they themselves are part of the elite, but about this concern around the rise of minor parties. And this seems to be the same thing. There's this concern that there's this rise of the minor parties and they're going to overwhelm the political discourse, as if this is some terrible thing that there might be multiple views expressed within a democracy, let alone a parliamentary democracy. And look, in part I think that has come from a general trust deficit of politicians, but not just politicians, judges, and actually the vast majority of our civic institutions. And part of that comes from our, I think, a lack of general education in the area, but also a lack of joining, as I described before. I think the other thing, though, is that because of the advent of social media and new media, this is not a criticism of you, Michael, it's okay. What we actually have is, you'll remember those fringes I referred to before. We have a political system that drives towards the centre, but we now have a way of accessing, in a way that we never accessed before, the multitude of voices. And we can find the people that agree with us and latch on to that context of those that agree with this particular view. But what that also drives is a mistrust of anyone who holds an alternative view. And often those that are trying to capture the support of one particular group in society are also trying to drive mistrust of, if not all, at least other parts of our society. Which means in aggregate, we're just building a generally higher level of mistrust of other parts of our society and politicians and political parties and groups that hold an alternative view. Now, with all of that, I think it's worth thinking about, well, what are some of the things that we could do? And I think the first observation, though, to make is that our structure actually supports this. It's a good thing in a polity that we give some expression to people who hold different views. So I'm not one that says, oh my God, there's an increase in the vote for minor parties. This is the end of the two-party world as we know it. I think it's good for democracy. I think it's good for our system of government that those views find some form of expression. You're desperate to ask a question.
Well, I can't help myself. So, aren't you meant to put a Labour view, a Labour view to this? I mean, we in the Fourth Estate like to think that we can talk about everything without actually nailing our flag to the mast, so to speak. But surely you must have a vision, a clear Labour view of where you want to go. So I was just wondering...
As opposed to just explaining the difficulties?
Yeah.
I'm driving to that now. So, but thank you. So the point I was going to make, though, is that one, our system of a compulsory, preferential, lower house system of voting still supports the stability of a two-party system regardless of the rise of minor parties, but we do see the reflection of minor party increase and those disparate views in our Senate electoral system. And whilst so many people do rail against, and we are frustrated, I am frustrated by the different views that are taken by those parties, often a populist, not a constructive view sometimes taken by the people that might hold those positions across the Senate, sometimes not even a realistic view, or definitely I think it would be fair to say that some of them don't have a consistent principled view about the things that they may do. At the end of the day, it does give them an expression of voice, and it does, I think, to mainly, so far, have an element of self-correction. One Nation in its first iteration fizzled away. It would appear that Nick Xenophon's team, SA Best, are on a downward slope. The Palmer United Party popped up and it disappeared. One Nation's come back in its second iteration. These things happen. There's obviously a consistent view that there are people who don't want to support major parties, but the Senate gives expression to that. But that's actually a good thing for our parliamentary system. And when we accept that instead of trying to rail against it, we may find more productive ways through it. Changes. The first thing I want to say about changes to our system is that nothing gets my goat more than people who talk about abolishing the states. And it's not because I'm from Western Australia. It's not because I'm from Western Australia. The reason that nothing gets my goat more than that when we talk about constructive reform is that it's never going to happen. There is no way through that pathway. And so in my view, will everyone please stop wasting their oxygen on it and find other ways to improve the system of government, because that is not going to be it. But I think there are a few things. The teaching of civics is actually critical to this. But what I've often talked to many people about how we need to teach civics better in our schools. We need to make sure that people who are new to this country better understand our systems of government, in particular that the ways of countries that they may have come from don't apply here, and for the better. What I've also come to realise more latterly, though, is that we need to teach civics better to our teachers at university. Because in the same way that I was disadvantaged in maths because my later primary school teachers just weren't that good at it and so didn't teach it, they weren't confident in it, we have that problem writ large across Australia because teachers are not confident in teaching civics. They're not confident, they don't understand the system. And I see examples of that frequently talking to the specialist teachers in this area in high schools in my electorate. Some are excellent, some actually don't know what's going on, and I don't mean in terms of day-to-day politics but the structures, and I think that would be fairly reflective of across the board, and that actually has a significant implication then if there is no confidence in our teaching group, they will not teach this, they just simply will avoid teaching the stuff in schools and they definitely won't teach it well. And it's really about, we talk about all the time making sure that our students are job ready. They can read and they can write and that they can do simple maths, but how do we make them job ready? Well, if you want to make people life ready, they've got to understand the world that they're going to be operating in, and actually understanding systems of government and the law is critical to that because people run up against it every day. The other thing I think is we do have this, as I said, this trust deficit and engaging with disengaged voters. Now, from a first principles point of view, I believe that good policy is good politics, but it does come down to the art of the selling sometimes, and being able to explain it not just to people in this room, but to people across the cross-sections of society. Being less cynical with people and levelling with people is important as part of that, but I think also is this need to make sure that we're continually looking at what are the underlying drivers of concern in society. So a constant refrain, and for my sins I spend probably too much time on Sky News talk shows, immigration numbers and overpopulation, as they would describe, become less of an issue for people if they believe that their infrastructure provision is sufficient, if they think that, if they believe and see that jobs are available and that employment levels are high. If social services are accessible and housing is affordable, then the other issues disappear. And I think more needs to be done to articulate that, and politicians need to focus more on those issues instead of trying to extenuate the difficulties that are created by some of these issues. They are really used as political foils. Longer term, a republic would be good. That would be a good change to parliamentary democracy in Australia. As an Irish Catholic who's effectively been constitutionally barred from having anything to do with being the head of state of this country, I have to say that it's particularly galling. One thing that's really practical though is I think we need to change the way that the committees of the House of Representatives work. So at the moment, they can't initiate their own inquiries other than in respect to the annual report of the agencies that come under their purview. They are controlled, of course, by government numbers, and so anything they decide to do is controlled by the government effectively. And in particular, there's no way for them at present to hold government ministers that are in the House of Representatives to account. As you will have seen, the Senate, because of its crossbench nature, in particular through the process of estimates, is able to bring ministers before it, or ministers representing ministers in the House of Representatives. But there is no actual way to bring those House of Representative ministers in front of a committee inquiry because the government controls those committees. And New Zealand went through a process probably close to 20 years ago now when it was reforming its parliamentary electoral processes, of also reforming its committee process to try and address these issues. Of course, as a unicameral system, it was even more important there. But I think there is an opportunity for us to re-look at the balance of how House of Representative committees work. Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and I'll get to it at the end.
That's okay. I'll take over now. Just thank you, Matt, for your
That's
talk.
okay.
And yes, it's good that we have participation. But I'll start off with the first question, and then we'll hand the microphone around.
I think we've already had the first two questions. But
we
you go,
we
Michael.
have, but I'll... have you finished?
Look, there's only a couple of things some observations I wanted to make. One is there is a trend towards less sitting weeks and in particular less sitting hours. And if you look at any graph that compares Australia's parliament to other comparable parliamentary systems, we provide a lot less hours of legislative scrutiny here than anyone else. And I think that is a concern. Having said that, you also need to measure that against the bubble that is created here. So, of course, not only is the more time that I spend here time away from my family, but it's more time in the bubble that is quite unrelated and disconnected from the actual needs and concerns of the electorate. So, but I think we need to acknowledge that there's a balance. And I'm not saying that hours spent in the chamber necessarily equal actual scrutiny of legislation, but it's something we need to bear in mind where we have a ever decreasing number of sitting weeks, sitting days and sitting hours. The other point is just that everyone likes to jump on the media and say it's the media's fault, they want to talk about sensationalist stuff, they want to talk about conflict, they don't want to talk about issues. I don't think there's a lot to be gained out of entering into that debate other than to say, do that, but if you could also report some news occasionally, that would be helpful as well. Because I think we have seen quite a merger of, particularly in print media, the idea of news and opinion has become a very grey area. And it's not a criticism of opinion, but just having someone else report the news and a broad spectrum of the news, not just say 2 or 3 issues, I think would be very helpful for political debate. Finally, things that we shouldn't do, some of which that people keep pushing, is electronic voting in elections, electronic voting in the chamber, and we shouldn't have more plebiscites. And the shouldn'ts, the should-nots, are just as important as the things we should change.
Oh, well, thank you, Matt. Please thank Matt for his... okay.
Should not.
Yeah, okay. No, so... all right, well, now we'll go to the questions. Just wait a minute. So the last time we had this forum, it was with Tim Wilson, and he spoke a lot about federalism and how it can be changed. What's your view on it? Obviously, as a West Australian member, you would have an interest in that. So Tim Wilson spoke about changing it completely, even in regards to how judges are appointed. What do you think of federalism and how is it workable going forward?
So I think federalism as a concept has worked very well for Australia because it's recognised our regional variation. And the reality is we are just physically a geographically massive nation. And as I tell people, the thing about a state government is a state government does things that you do and interact with every day. It runs your schools, it runs your hospitals, they literally build the roads that you drive on. Federal governments, by and large, set funding priorities in that area, which is very important, but they don't do a lot. The primary thing that the federal government does that people interact with on a daily basis is pay the pension or pay a welfare check. That is what they do. And I think there's many examples writ large of where governments at a federal level doing things can end in disaster, to be frank. But the funding priorities are really important. I used to work for a state government minister many years ago. And the thing that I was continually confronted by, and part of the things that drove me into federal politics as opposed to having an interest in state politics, was that federal funding priority, that you were, as a state government, always banging your head against that. And that does create a tension, if you like, as I'm sure all of you are aware, but that I was more interested in the priority setting than the doing the thing on the ground. There are people that are just better at that than I am, but I think about the priorities. But the thing is, that's what state governments do. A federal system is very good. Recalibrating it within the realms of the Constitution, given that you'll never get a change through on that issue, I believe. Well, I don't accept the pretext of the question, because you're asking a question about specific technical issue. But this is not a constitutional document is now not actually about a technical issue. It's about the balance that is struck between political community. Now, you're right. If you look at our constitution, it is actually based as much on convention as it is on the written word. The concept of cabinet government and a prime minister really doesn't exist in our constitution. And of course, there are parts of our constitution from a race point of view and others that seem to some extent an anathema to us now. But in terms of the crux of it is the political bargain that was struck. And it was a political bargain struck over 100 years ago, but it is one that still holds, which is that we have states that come together to be part of one nation that share the governance of issues that are of national concern, and those issues are articulated in the Constitution. And fundamentally, that's what the Constitution does.
Okay, well, I'll open it up,
So last time we came, as Michael said, Tim was talking about pushing stuff back to the state, and that's good to a certain degree. But how do you push things like defence, border protection, defence? Someone said defence again. How do you push those national security issues? AFP, for example. AFP they don't just look after Canberra; they look after the airports, border control. How do you push those back to the states?
Well, I wouldn't. So I suppose the reality is Tim would probably agree with me on that anyway, that there are still... Tim and I would disagree on this. We wouldn't disagree that there should be a national government. The disagreement is the level of which the states and the Commonwealth do things. So the classic example that was being looked at in part of Tony Abbott's federalism white paper, which died under Malcolm Turnbull, were things like, why have a Department of Education at a federal level? Why have a Department of Health at a federal level? Why stop the states from raising income tax? You could push all of these things back. Now, you can and you could do that. The reality is, if you look at, say, to take the United States as an example versus Australia as a federal model, as a former corporate lawyer, having 50 different corporations laws is awesome. But it's not a great way to run a country, especially when there's only 25 million of you. So the efficiencies that are gained through that continual process of not just using the existing heads of power under the Constitution, but also our COAG processes to drive harmonisation are a very good thing. Yes, because that was about securities law, but it wasn't about how corporations run themselves. And but there's still 50 different corporations laws. And so that's a critical difference. The other concern that I have is that because states haven't raised income tax in 50 plus years, is if you were to hand that power back to the states, to what extent is there the capacity for them to run that system? Because at the moment, states do a very good job of blaming the Commonwealth for all of their money problems. I don't think they want that power.
Of course not. You mentioned before about the rise of the small parties. So we've had some great democracies and some that have been going on for a long time, like Italy and Germany. I mean, Italy, for example, right?
Nowhere near as long as us.
They still run, right? I mean, they've got crazy-ass parties all over the place, right? And it still runs. So the two-party system is not there. Isn't it more democratic to have someone like a Pauline Hanson or that woman from Tasmania? They are actually representative, even though they are in their own little small parties. So isn't it actually more democratic to have lots of crazy-ass parties in there and actually work with that?
The point that I was making is that we have, if you like, the best of both worlds. We have the stability of a preferential system in the lower house, and we have the capacity, because of the proportional system in the Senate, to affect the representation of both. And you can't just go and compare our system of government straight out with Germany or Italy or France, because the relationship between their executives and the houses of their parliaments is quite different, depending on which country you're looking at. So, as a Westminster democracy, we bring out the opportunity for both. And I think sometimes the discussion around, you can play around the edges, but at the end of the day, is there much to be gained out of continually debating the structure as opposed to learning how to deal with the political reality, which, as you point out, so many countries negotiate through all the time?
Okay, I'm next. Matt, you spoke about engagement, and I know that in your electorate you do beers in Burt. I want to know, is it just to have beers, or do people come, do you hear from them, what are the outcomes? Would you recommend it to some of your other parliamentary colleagues?
Absolutely. So for Catherine's clearly an avid follower of beers in Burt. So this was a process that we started during the election campaign last 2016 and have continued on, which is basically going to different pubs on a regular basis around the electorate on a Friday night, and with a group of volunteers, and a lot of them hopefully in Matt Keogh t-shirts, which provides a bit of branding as we go. But also for me to then go around in those pubs and talk to people there. And we talk about disengaged and disaffected voters. Well, often that's because we just don't go out and talk to people. So we talk about the traditional campaigning model of going out and door knocking, or then we've progressed to phone calling and phone banking, and I do all of these, and also coffees with Keogh, going to a cafe, having people come to a mobile office, and they're all good. But there's a whole group of people out there that are not doing any of that stuff, and frankly they don't care. But if I go and approach them at a pub and say, "Hi, I'm your local federal member, happy to have a chat about anything you want," or not, at the very least, they've met me, they know who I am, they may remember me. The guys on the Bucks party last Friday will definitely remember they spent half an hour talking to... they wanted to talk to me. They will remember that. I'm sure that forevermore they'll be talking about, "I remember on your Bucks party and we talked that..." So you get to have some very authentic conversations with people that would never come to approach a politician. And in my electorate, lots of people go out on a Friday night to local pubs. And I'm sure that's probably true of many electorates around Australia. So why don't we go and talk to those people? And that's really what we and what I decided to do, which is, well, let's go talk to them. They might tell you to, I won't say that word, off. But often, at least for a short period of time, they do want to engage with you, and they feel refreshed that someone bothered to ask.
So, Matt,
yeah.
How would I explain your brand to a friend?
How would you explain my brand to a friend? That is a really interesting question.
You're making assumptions, Roger.
I always have.
The assumption's been Roger has friends.
So before I answer that, I want to do a bit of a quiz from some of the questions that Michael asked me to address for the room, okay? So I'm going to read you two profiles, and I want you to just think about this, okay? So let me see if I can find the right page. That'll be helpful. Here we go. Good. Okay. So someone who was a union workplace delegate when they worked in the public sector. They've worked as a policy officer and a ministerial advisor. They have an arts degree. They've got a relative who has been an ALP candidate and even sat on the state executive. They grew up in a poorer outer suburb. They used to be the chair of a local community group, and they're from a traditionally persecuted ethnic minority. Now, pick the party that they represent. Yeah, someone already yelled out that they thought they were a Labor person. You've gone with One Nation. Green, okay, yeah. Okay. Now this person, they're an international corporate lawyer. They've got relatives that have previously been a Liberal candidate and they were a state councillor. They've been president of a law society, they were private school educated, they go to church regularly, and they grew up in a leafy green area.
The Greens candidate for Batman.
Labor.
Right. They're both me. So, in answer to your question about how would I pick my brand, I'm the kid that grew up in my suburb, and I'm here to be the best advocate for you.
Well, thank you, Matt. But it is about improving the model of parliamentary democracy. So what do you think about having career politicians, and how is it that we are going to improve the model?
So career politicians, and that's why I prepared that sort of delineation there, actually, was in response to that question. I don't think the issue is about whether career politicians are good or bad. I think the issue is about making sure that we maintain a diversity across our parliament, because at the end of the day, having people who know who the players are, how the system works, is a really good thing. But having people who come in as authentic outsiders who have a genuine community commitment because of their background is also vitally important. Having men and women is vitally important. Having people who are Indigenous, come from an ethnic minority, people who have got an Anglo background, vitally important as well. Having some people with business experience, people that have come out of the community sector, whether that's union movement or not-for-profit, people that have had experience of working in the public sector, whether they're city or regional, all of those things are actually really important. So are career politicians important? Sometimes, and in some areas, yeah, that is important. Do we want a whole parliament of those people? No, we don't.
How do you ensure that you have that balance?
Well, the city, so how do we ensure that balance? The city regional thing's baked in because we have geographically diverse electorates, but that also produces differences in how we end up with that result, because electorates look for different things in the people that represent them. So, you know, at one level you could say, oh, that Matt Keogh, he worked for a minister in a previous Labor government, so he's one of those politician guys. But on the other level, there's other things.
I was going to say, the polling booth may be totally opposed to where you are, but you are willing. So, Matt, what I put to you is that in your electorate you'll have polling booths. Right? So, in those polling booths, you may, yeah, absolutely, a lot of people. Yep. Totally appreciate that, and they're all entitled to their view. But by and large, a polling booth might turn around and go, I'm against Matt. Mm-hmm. How do you then go back into that booth and convince them I'm your man?
Yeah. Well, because I'm there to represent the entire community. And so when I go and do beers in Burt, when I do coffees with Keogh, when I'm out engaging with the community, door knocking, when I'm looking at the things that I'm pushing for our electorate and the issues and, if you like, the projects within the area, I don't exclude a geographical area. I'm there for them. Now, I can only do the best job I can do and continually to advocate for the policies and for the issues that are relevant for the electorate. They may or may not engage, but I'm not also going to be a chameleon that is someone different over there to someone over to when I'm over here. So it's important to adapt, because one of the things about politics, and we talk about disaffected voters, is there is no point in me rocking up in a suit and tie in most of my electorate, because that's just going to put a whole heap of people off. That's the reality. But that's not being a chameleon, that's being relatable and approachable. That's important for people. And it's actually one of the, you asked, Michael had spoken to me before about, you know, what makes Australian political system different. You can actually go and find and talk to a member of parliament in Australia. You go around to most countries in the world, good luck getting anywhere near a member of parliament. Whether it's because of security concerns and they're surrounded by a heap of bodyguards, or because they never make themselves accessible to their electorate. You can go down to Coles or Bunnings and find me. I mean, my wife said to me the other day, I was supposed to be coming back from doing some stuff. It's like, we had my parents coming over, you're running half an hour late. And I said, yes, but when I went to Bunnings, in my head, I was going in, getting that, and coming out. But talking to the girl guides that were running the barbecue out the front, talking to the guy that works part-time at Bunnings about his entry in the local art competition, and talking to a constituent as I was trying to put my stuff in my car, sort of held me up. But it's also my job. I actually love it. That's probably, my wife complains about that. I love it. But our politicians are accessible, and that's a great thing.
Well, well, I think at the moment we should definitely say that Matt has well and truly answered the $64 question. So please join me in thanking Matt Keogh MP. And thank you everyone for coming. Please enjoy the hospitality and the drinks, and continue your conversations.
Well done, mate.